Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
You ever sit at a dinner table listening to the clinking of silverware and the polite laughter of people you've known your whole life, and suddenly realize you don't belong there? Not really, not in the way you thought you did. That was me sitting at the head of the table at my mother's 75th birthday, the smell of roasted duck and overcooked green beans in the air, when she lifted her glass of white wine, cleared her throat with that fake, demure elegance she reserved for special announcements, and turned the evening into something I would never forget. She looked across the table, right past me as if I were just another flower arrangement, and smiled warmly at my younger brother Mark, the golden boy who'd never heard a no in his life, and said, "I've decided to leave everything to your brother. No hesitation, no softening of the blow, no explanation, just a clean slice, like a guillotine, right there between the mashed potatoes and the silence that followed." I didn't flinch, I didn't cry, I didn't even blink. I just reached into my purse, pulled out a thick white envelope, and placed it on the table in front of her, sliding it across the linen like it was nothing more than a dinner check. "That's great," I said, my voice calm, maybe even a little amused, "because I don't need it anymore." Her smile faltered just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, the microscopic twitch of the lip, the pause of her hand as she lowered her glass. Mark looked between us, confused, probably wondering if he'd missed part of the conversation or if this was some kind of test. But I just leaned back in my chair, took a sip of my water, and let the weight of the moment settle across the room like a fog creeping in off the bay. I had spent my whole life being the afterthought, the daughter who didn't need help, didn't ask for money, didn't screw up publicly enough to warrant a rescue. Mark was the one who crashed 3 cars before he was 25 and somehow got rewarded with a down payment for a 4th. I was the one who paid my own way through college, took night classes while working 2 jobs, and still got asked at every holiday dinner why I wasn't more like Mark. And for years I stayed quiet, kept my head down, played the good daughter even when it burned. But this dinner, it wasn't just a birthday party. It was the final chapter of a book I'd been writing silently for over a decade. See, 6 months earlier, I'd found something buried deep in a file in my late father's old safe deposit box, something that changed everything. But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you what it's like to be invisible in your own family, to be treated like a guest in the house you helped clean, to be expected to serve the wine and clear the plates while your brother is toasted like a king returning from war. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every forced family photo, Mark got the center spot, the attention, the grace. I got the chore list, the side comments, the backhanded compliments like, "You're so independent," which really meant, "We don't have to bother with you." As I sat there at that long oak table, surrounded by people who'd known me since birth and still didn't see me, I watched my mother beam at Mark, her hand on his shoulder like he'd just won a damn Pulitzer, and I remembered every time she dismissed me, every time she cut me off mid-sentence to ask Mark about his job, even when he was unemployed, or every time she reminded me, gently but with purpose, that a woman's worth was found in who she married, not what she built. Mark had 2 divorces, a failed landscaping business, and still lived off investments that he only had because Dad left him a tidy little portfolio. I had my own house, my own business, no debt, and no one in the family even asked what I did anymore. So when she said those words, "I've decided to leave everything to your brother," I wasn't surprised. I was prepared. I'd known it was coming, felt it in the air like static before a storm. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already made my move. I didn't want her money. I didn't need her approval. What I wanted was that look, the one she gave me when she opened the envelope and started reading the document inside. Her face didn't drop, not immediately, but her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the paper, her eyes flicking back to me, then to Mark, then back to the words in front of her. It was the trust revocation, not just any trust. The one she didn't know still listed me as co-executor of our father's estate. The one she assumed had been quietly updated years ago. It hadn't, That document in that envelope was a legal declaration that gave me control over the cabin, the stocks, even the cemetery plots. I had waited. I had played dumb. I had nodded and smiled through years of passive-aggressive digs and ignored birthdays. And now, finally, I was watching her realize that while she'd been busy preparing to crown Mark the heir of her tiny kingdom, I'd been building an empire of my own. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been written off so many times that you start to wonder if maybe they're right? And then one day you get the chance to prove, not just to them, but to yourself, that they never really knew you at all? Because that's where the story begins. Not at the dinner table, not with the toast, but years before, in the quiet, in the moments where I decided I wasn't going to fight for their approval, I was going to outgrow it. And in doing so, I found something far more powerful than revenge. I found freedom, but don't get too comfortable. That was just the first move. What came next? That's where the real game began. They say birth order shapes your destiny, that the way your parents treat you as a child becomes the lens through which you see the world for the rest of your life. And I used to think that was just another excuse people used to explain why they ended up bitter, broken, or bored with their lives. But now, looking back, I realize it's more than just psychology. It's a script that someone else writes for you before you can even hold a pen. And in my case, that script had one line for me and an entire Broadway show for my younger brother, Mark. From the moment he arrived, loud, colicky, and always needing attention, he became the sun around which our family orbited. And I became the backup generator, useful in emergencies, quiet in the corner, only noticed when something stopped working. Even as kids, the difference in how we were treated was so obvious it bordered on theatrical. When I brought home straight A's, it was expected, hardly mentioned at dinner, maybe a passing "good job, honey," if my mother wasn't too distracted by Mark's latest tantrum over not getting the right brand of peanut butter in his lunch. When Mark got a B- in algebra, the whole house celebrated as if he'd just been accepted into Harvard. And my father actually opened a bottle of wine that night, not because of the grade itself, but because Mark had finally applied himself, which apparently was more important than results. I remember sitting at the table that evening, my untouched report card still in my backpack, and watching my mother spoon extra potatoes onto Mark's plate like he was some kind of war hero returning from battle, while I chewed silently on dry chicken and the growing realization that no matter what I did, I would never be enough. But I didn't rebel. I didn't scream or demand fairness, or try to act out the way some kids do when they feel invisible. No, I did what I've always done. I adapted. I learned early on that being loud didn't get you heard. It just made them more annoyed. So I became quiet but sharp, observant in ways that Mark never had to be. While he threw tantrums and failed classes and crashed our parents' cars with the kind of carefree arrogance that only comes from knowing there will be no consequences, I learned how to read people, how to plan, how to predict what came next, and prepare for it in silence. I got my first job at 16, not because I had to, but because I wanted the taste of independence no one thought I needed. And when I left for college on a full scholarship, one I had earned by working harder than anyone else I knew, my mother didn't cry at the airport. She just nodded and said, "Well, at least you won't be a burden." That sentence never left me. It branded itself into the back of my brain, a cruel little whisper that echoed every time I achieved something no one bothered to ask about. Meanwhile, Mark stayed close, because of course he did. He flunked out of community college after one semester, blamed the professors for being too political, and moved back home with some grand plan about starting a landscaping company that lasted all of 6 months. When it failed, our mother blamed the economy, not the fact that he spent more time buying expensive tools than actually getting clients. And somehow, after all of that, he still got a condo, paid for partially with money from the trust fund Dad had left behind. For emergencies. Though apparently Mark's lack of effort qualified as one. Me? I never touched a cent of that trust. Not because I couldn't, but because I knew it would come with strings, calls from my mother reminding me to say thank you, invitations to dinners where I'd be reminded that I owed everything to their generosity. I wanted nothing from them, not even acknowledgement, because I had come to understand that the only power I had in that family was in the things I didn't need from them. And while all this was happening, through the jobs, the promotions, the late nights building a business they never asked about, I was planning, not revenge, not yet. But I was preparing for the moment when I'd no longer have to play the role they wrote for me. I knew it would come because people like my mother can't help themselves. They're too hungry for control, too convinced that their power lies in the way they distribute crumbs to the children they believe they've made in their own image. But I wasn't her. I wasn't fragile or dependent or easily manipulated by guilt. I was something else entirely, a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated, which, as it turns out, is one hell of a weapon if you know how to wield it. The real shift happened when I bought the cabin, the same one we used to visit every summer when Dad was alive, the one with the peeling blue shutters and the dock that creaked under our small feet as kids. It had been abandoned for years after Dad passed, falling into disrepair, eventually listed in some obscure county ledger as part of the residual estate. I found it by accident while doing title research for a client. It was still in the family name, but legally unclaimed due to paperwork my mother never followed up on. So I claimed it, quietly, legally, paid the back taxes, filed the proper forms, transferred it into a holding company that no one would trace back to me, and waited. That cabin became my first victory, not just because it was a tangible asset, but because it was a piece of the past. One they had forgotten, but I had never let go of. It was proof that you could reclaim something lost, something taken, without asking permission. And that feeling, that power, was intoxicating. I started looking at everything differently after that. If the cabin had slipped through their fingers, what else had they overlooked? What other doors had they assumed were locked simply because they never bothered to check? I became obsessed with the fine print, the old documents, the forgotten clauses buried in decades-old wills and trusts. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to build something, a foundation, a fortress, a financial structure so sound and so subtle that even if they woke up one day and realized what I'd done, it would already be too late. And still, I said nothing. I smiled at dinners, sent birthday cards, played the part of the dutiful daughter with just enough distance to remain unthreatening. Until now. Now I've got the deeds, the documents, the leverage, and they've got assumptions. Let's see how far that gets them. The envelope I slid across the table wasn't just a document. It was a decade of restraint, planning, and bitter clarity folded into one final, silent declaration that I was no longer playing by the rules my family had imposed on me since childhood. And while the rest of them passed it around like it was some meaningless afterthought, I watched their eyes move across the lines they didn't yet understand. And I waited, not for their approval because I had given up on that years ago, but for that subtle shift in the air when someone realizes they've misjudged you so profoundly that the truth lands like a slap they never saw coming. That paper, signed and notarized 6 months earlier in an office downtown with a lawyer who never once asked why I was smiling during the entire meeting, was the legal execution of a trust adjustment I had quietly pursued for over a year. It wasn't the kind of move you make out of spite, not at first. It began as a safeguard, an instinct I couldn't quite explain, but knew I had to follow. You see, when you grow up with a mother who weaponizes kindness, who hands out affection like rationed sugar only when you're obedient enough or quiet enough or pleasing enough to be worthy of it, you learn to stop asking and start securing your own exits, because one day you'll need them more than air. It started with a phone call to the bank, a routine question about an old family account Dad had once mentioned in passing during a rare moment of genuine conversation. He had always been the quieter one, more reserved than the force of nature that was our mother, and in the final year of his life, he had taken to talking to me during late-night walks on the porch whenever she had fallen asleep. One night, he mentioned the trust, not in detail, just enough to plant a seed. He said, "It's strange, you know. People think leaving money behind is simple, but it's not. There are layers, hidden things. Sometimes the things you don't say are more powerful than the ones you do." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I do. The original trust was established when I was 14 and Mark was 11. It named both of us as beneficiaries, but included a clause, barely legible in the scan I finally obtained, that stated control would default to the eldest surviving child, should our parents pass. That clause meant nothing to anyone who assumed Mark would inherit everything simply because he had always been treated as the favorite. But legally, on paper, I had a foot in the door, and I didn't just step through it. I rebuilt the entire house behind it. The lawyer I hired was discreet, expensive, and thorough. She combed through the estate paperwork with the kind of precision most people reserve for criminal investigations. And what she found was a list of assets, property, stocks, dormant accounts, that had all been placed in various shelves for tax purposes, but had never been updated after my father's death. That meant there were loose threads everywhere, and with the right permissions, which I happened to already hold, I could reconfigure the structure without even informing my mother or brother. Because as co-executor, my rights extended to any portion of the estate still operating under the original trust. It took months, quiet transfers, silent paperwork, legal amendments that required no public disclosure. By the time the dinner arrived, the lake cabin was no longer just a memory. It was mine, legally and entirely. The stock portfolio that my father had once described as his quiet retirement parachute was already rerouted into an investment structure in my name. And the cemetery plots, yes, even those, had been moved into a family preservation deed, which I controlled. It wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about ownership, about claiming what no one thought I had the intelligence or nerve to take. So when I handed over the envelope, I did it with the kind of calm only someone who has already won can afford to feel. I didn't need to raise my voice, because the paper spoke louder than anything I could have said. My mother stared at it longer than anyone else. Her fingers trembled just slightly, not from fear. I knew her too well for that. But from something worse, the first inkling of being outmaneuvered by the daughter she had always assumed was playing a smaller game. Mark, of course, reacted like a man who had just realized his childhood participation trophies didn't come with real-world power. "What is this?" he asked, half laughing, half panicking, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something more comforting if he just blinked hard enough. I didn't answer. I wanted him to read it. I wanted him to see the signatures, the dates, the clear, clinical language that left no room for interpretation. The trust had been restructured, the assets redirected, the control transferred to me. "I thought everything was going to Mark," my aunt whispered, as if her voice might somehow erase what was in front of her. My mother stayed quiet. She was calculating, as she always did, running probabilities in her head, scanning for escape routes, but there weren't any. Not anymore. And here's the part that still makes me smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub it in or throw their hypocrisy in their faces. I let the silence speak. Let the years of dismissal and condescension echo back at them from the corners of that perfectly decorated dining room. Because power, real power, doesn't shout. It simply walks in, calmly rewrites the ending, and waits. What none of them realized that night was that I hadn't just changed the paperwork. I had changed the story. The narrative they'd clung to for decades, the roles we'd all been forced to play, had just been torn up and rewritten. And the best part, I hadn't broken a single rule. I had simply read the fine print, something they had never bothered to do. And still, the best was yet to come. Because while they were still digesting the first bite of truth, I had already prepared the second course. There are things a person can forgive, or at least pretend to forget in the name of peace, civility, or that stubborn familial loyalty that clings to you like humidity in July. No matter how far you move or how long it's been since anyone truly made you feel like family. But then there are betrayals that mark you, not just emotionally but biologically, as if your DNA itself twists slightly out of shape from the sheer force of what someone else took from you, without apology, without acknowledgement, and without the faintest recognition of what they destroyed in the process. And for me, that thing, the one wound that never scabbed over, the one theft that I never spoke of aloud, not even to the few friends I dared to trust, was the daughter I never got to hold. Not because she was taken by death, or chance, or fate, but because my mother decided I wasn't fit to be a mother, and worse, convinced me to agree. I was 22, I had just finished college, was working my second job, and living in a cramped studio apartment that overlooked a crumbling laundromat and a parking lot full of broken glass and broken dreams. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had earned it. Every chipped tile and flickering bulb, and in the middle of all that grayness, I found out I was pregnant. The father, a bartender named Evan, had disappeared as soon as I told him. No arguments, no drama, just a long silence followed by a final text that read, "You'll be fine. You're stronger than this." I wanted to believe him. I did. I didn't run to my mother, not at first. I avoided the phone calls, the emails, the passive-aggressive, just checking in messages that always came with an undertone of judgment. But eventually the weight of it, of everything, pushed me toward her door, because even though I had learned not to trust her completely, some part of me still believed that a mother should know, that maybe, just maybe, hearing she was going to be a grandmother might soften her edges, might make her remember the softness she used to have once upon a time, when I was small and still worthy of her full attention. What I got instead was a monologue dressed as concern, layered with words like future, stability, and disgrace. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her disapproval was sharper when whispered. She spoke about sacrifice, about the opportunities I'd throw away, about how hard it had been for her to raise 2 children, even with a husband and a house and money. And then came the sentence that haunted me. If you keep it, your life is over. It wasn't a warning, it was a verdict. I remember sitting there, my hands wrapped around the warm mug of tea she had offered out of habit rather than comfort, and feeling something inside me fracture, quietly, the way thin ice cracks beneath weight that's just light enough to go unnoticed until it's too late. I didn't fight, I didn't scream, I nodded. I let her make the appointment. I let her drive me. I let her sit in the waiting room while I signed the papers. And afterward, when it was done, she told me I was brave. Brave for choosing logic over emotion. Brave for not ruining my life. Brave for being like her. I was not brave. I was broken. And I hated her for thinking they were the same thing. It took years before I could say the word daughter out loud without feeling like I was being split in half. I never told anyone, not Mark, not friends, not the man I later married and divorced with surgical efficiency when I realized I couldn't stand to share my life with someone who mistook silence for peace. But that child, the one I never held, never named, never buried, she stayed with me, not as a ghost, but as a shadow, a reminder that my mother didn't just control finances or holidays, or the way the family narrative was spun. She controlled futures. She stole mine with a smile and the quiet confidence of someone who had done it before and would do it again. So when people ask me why I went so far, why I dug through every document and rewrote every piece of the puzzle she thought she'd glued together for Mark, it wasn't just about evening the scales. It was about reclaiming something, about refusing to be the girl who sat quietly, while her life was planned out for her by someone who measured love in obedience and power in silence. It was about standing up finally and saying, "You took something from me, and I'm taking something back." Mark never knew about the pregnancy. To him, I was just the responsible sister, the one who made safe choices, the one who always played it smart but never loud. He never saw the way my eyes burned every time our mother praised him for being father material, even after his second DUI, or how I clenched my fists under the table when she cooed about his ex-wife's kids like they were her own. And when I sat across from him that night after the dinner, after the envelope, after the first wave of realization had crashed and receded, and he looked at me like I had kicked down a door he didn't even know existed, I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I already changed the deed to the lake house, I said, my voice low, flat, unforgiving. 3 months ago, it's in my name. Legally, irrevocably. You won't see a dime from it. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than crying. Or maybe because he still believed deep down that our mother would fix it. That she'd swoop in with one of her lectures or threats or backroom deals and make it all go away. I let him have that laugh. Let him cling to the illusion. Because what came next, what I had planned next, was the kind of reckoning no amount of denial could soften. You see, when someone takes your future and sells it back to you as protection, you learn to become dangerous in ways they never taught you. You learn patience. You learn strategy. You learn that revenge isn't an explosion. It's a slow, surgical undoing of everything they thought was permanent. And the most satisfying part? They'll never see it coming until it's already done. The thing about power, the real kind, the kind you don't talk about in polite company or brag about over cocktails, is that it doesn't come with fireworks or trumpets or some grand cinematic reveal that leaves everyone gasping in awe. No, real power is quiet, methodical, and mercilessly patient. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't knock, it doesn't wait, it just walks right in like it was always meant to be there. And by the time anyone notices, the game has already changed. That's exactly what happened that night after the toast, after the envelope, after my mother's carefully orchestrated announcement unraveled like a badly sewn hem in front of the only audience that ever really mattered to her, her family. I had spent the better part of my adult life being dismissed, downplayed, and underestimated, made to feel like I was always just adjacent to the spotlight, just off-center, never quite enough to be noticed unless I was useful. And even then, only in the most transactional way, like a can opener or a spare tire. But that night, as I sat at the end of the table with my hands folded calmly in my lap, while Mark's mouth hung open and my mother tried to reassemble her composure like shattered glass in trembling fingers, I realized that I no longer wanted what they had denied me all those years. Not their praise, not their apology, and certainly not their money. Because when you've already built your life from the ashes of what they tried to burn, when you've carved out success from the silence they left you in, and when you finally understood that the only validation worth having is the one you give yourself, you reach a point where revenge stops being about payback and becomes something even sharper, more cutting, indifference. That night, I didn't just win, I walked away free. After the dinner ended, after the uncomfortable silences and stiff goodbyes and glances that couldn't quite meet mine, Mark followed me outside into the driveway like some confused puppy, still trying to make sense of what had happened. He was angry, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the bewildered, entitled kind. The kind of anger that simmers beneath the surface when a man who's been handed everything his whole life finally hears the word no and doesn't know how to process it. He asked me how I could do this to the family, to him, to Mom. He even had the nerve to say the word betrayal, like I hadn't spent 3 decades watching him fumble and fail and still end up praised while I broke my back just to be ignored. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I simply told him that I hadn't done anything to the family. I'd done something for myself. For the first time, unapologetically. And that if he wanted to play the victim, he'd better start by explaining why he thought he was owed anything in the first place. He had no answer, of course. Only a bitter laugh and a warning glare, as if somehow he could still intimidate me into undoing what I had already secured. But you can't threaten someone who has nothing left to lose, and I had already burned every bridge worth crossing behind me. The final blow came 2 weeks later, quietly, as most significant things do. My mother tried to overturn the trust. She hired a lawyer, an old friend of the family, a man who had once referred to me as the quiet one at a New Year's Eve party, while refilling my wine glass without asking. He sent me a letter filled with polite threats and veiled suggestions about my intentions and the spirit of the estate. I responded with a notarized reply drafted by my own legal team. People who didn't know me as a daughter or a sister or a girl who never got invited to the father-daughter dance, but as a client, a woman who paid them well to ensure that not one word of what she had built could be undone. They folded. Of course they did. Because while my mother was busy social climbing and Mark was busy failing upwards, I was building. And now the structure was too solid to be shaken by the desperate tremors of a family used to getting their way through guilt and inheritance. And then I did the unthinkable. I gave it up. Not all of it, not the control, not the leverage. I'm not a fool. But the money, the properties I didn't care about, the assets that meant nothing to me beyond their symbolic value, I sold them. Quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. I donated portions to causes my mother would have found scandalous: women's shelters, legal funds for single mothers, education grants for girls from broken homes. The cabin, the one piece that still stirred something in me, I kept. Not for nostalgia, but because it reminded me of my father, the one person who had once said, in a moment I'll never forget, "Sometimes the person who watches the quietest ends up knowing the most." He was right. The rest, I let it go because the truth is, I don't need it anymore. I don't need the estate, or the house with the tacky crown molding, or the cars Mark never paid for, or the grudging praise that only came when I was convenient. What I needed was closure. What I needed was proof that I could undo decades of erasure with one decisive act. And I got it. Now I live differently, not extravagantly, but intentionally. I wake up in a house I chose, surrounded by silence that I earned. I keep a photograph on the mantle, not of the family I came from, but of a place I once stood alone, pregnant, terrified, and unheard. It reminds me of who I was, who I survived being, who I refused to remain. And beside it, folded carefully into a small wooden box, is a letter. It's addressed to someone named Sophie. No return address, no date, just words. Words I couldn't say back then, when I was too young and too scared and too buried under my mother's version of what was best. Words that maybe one day she'll read. Until then, I'll be here, letting them fight over what's left, because I'm already gone.